Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Gregg Roman, the director of the Middle East Forum, joining us today to discuss the topic of Syria and the future of its multi-billion-dollar Captagon industry after the fall of the Assad regime. Mr. Roman will speak for 20 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Gregg Roman.
Thank you very much, Ahnaf. On December 8th, 2024, as Bashar al-Assad's regime crumbled in the face of a lightning offensive by Syrian rebels, one of the most sophisticated drug operations in history began to emerge from the shadows. The Fall of Damascus revealed not just the end of a political dynasty, but the exposure of an industrial-scale narcotics empire that had transformed Syria into what experts called the world's premier narco state. Within days of taking control, the forces led by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham began inviting international journalists to witness something extraordinary. At military bases, government facilities, and seemingly legitimate businesses across Syria, they discovered vast stockpiles of a small white pill marked with two interlocking half moons, Captagon. This amphetamine-type stimulant had become Syria's most valuable export. The scale was staggering. In the Maza Air Base in Damascus alone, journalists documented warehouses filled with millions of pills. At a former potato chip factory in Douma, rebels found industrial-scale production facilities capable of producing tons of the drug. But perhaps most striking was the sophistication of the operation. Pills hidden inside everything from hollow pomegranates to voltage regulators, demonstrating a level of complexity that could have only been achieved with state support. This wasn't just another case of corruption or organized crime operating within a failed state. It was a narcotics empire. What emerged was evidence of a deliberate strategy by the Assad regime to transform Syria into what one might call a pharmaceutical narco state, where drug production and trafficking became not just tolerated, but industrialized and perfected under state protection. The story of Syria's Captagon Empire did not begin in Damascus, but in a laboratory in West Germany. In 1961, a researcher named Karl-Heinz Klinger at the pharmaceutical company Degasa completed the synthesis of phenolphthalein, a new drug that would be marketed under the brand name Captagon. The drug was developed as an alternative to amphetamine and methamphetamine, which were both being used as medicines at the time, particularly for treating narcolepsy, depression, and attention deficit disorders. But what made Captagon unique was its claimed ability to provide the benefits of methamphetamines without causing dangerous spikes in blood pressure. The drug quickly gained popularity, particularly in the Middle East, where one Egyptian pharmaceutical company owner, Rita Yastas, noticed its widespread use. As he would later testify in a German court, he said, quote, "There was a great demand for phenolphthalein there, perhaps because constant heat makes you so tired, or because the Quran forbids alcohol." Captagon was legally prescribed across Europe and the Middle East for nearly 2 decades. However, by the 1980s, its highly addictive nature and dangerous side effects, including anxiety, depression, and psychosis, led to increasing restrictions. In 1986, following a request from Degasa itself, the first time a pharmaceutical company had asked for its drug to be regulated, the World Health Organization and UN Commission on Narcotics Drugs designated phenolphthalein as a controlled substance. But by then, a parallel black market had already developed, particularly in the Middle East. Production shifted to Eastern Europe, specifically at that time, communist Bulgaria, where the state security apparatus, the DS, protected and facilitated the trade. Working with Lebanese drug traffickers like Abdul Hamid Shama, who provided pill pressing equipment, Bulgarian facilities began producing counterfeit Captagon tablets. According to Bulgarian investigative journalist Christo Christov's research into recently opened state files, the revenues provided the communist government with a critical source of foreign currency during its final years. The drug also found a unique niche in sports, particularly in Europe. In 2015, a French investigative journalist revealed that members of the French rugby team had taken Captagon before a notoriously violent 1986 match against New Zealand's All Blacks. The drug's ability to increase aggression and eliminate fatigue made it particularly attractive to athletes willing to risk its side effects for a competitive edge. But when Bulgaria cracked down on production in the early 2000s as part of its efforts to join the European Union, the Captagon trade didn't disappear, it simply migrated. Production first shifted to Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, a region long known for drug production and controlled by Hezbollah. But it was Syria's descent into civil war in 2011 that would transform the Captagon trade into something unprecedented in scale and sophistication. The Assad regime, facing international isolation and crushing sanctions, saw its economy collapse. In fact, Syria's GDP plummeted from $60 billion in 2010 to $9 billion in 2021. And with legitimate revenue sources drying up and foreign currency reserves depleting, the regime needed a new source of income. Captagon provided the perfect solution. Syria had several crucial advantages that made it ideal for large-scale Captagon production. First was its established pharmaceutical industry, which provided the technical expertise and equipment needed for drug manufacturing. Second was its chemical sector, which could supply or import the precursor chemicals under the guise of legitimate industrial use. Third was a state apparatus willing to protect and facilitate the trade. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. In the early years of the Civil War, armed groups, including some rebels, produced Captagon to fund their operations. But as the Assad regime consolidated its control over much of Syria with Russian and Iranian help between 2017 and 2018, began systematically taking over and industrializing the Captagon trade. According to documents and evidence recently uncovered after Assad's fall last month, the regime developed a sophisticated system that integrated Captagon production into existing state and military structures. The Syrian military's elite 4th Armored Division, commanded by Assad's brother, Maher al-Assad, became the primary overseer of both production and distribution. Military bases were converted into manufacturing centers, while state-owned companies provided covers for smuggling operations. The numbers reveal the staggering scale of this transformation. By 2024, the global Captagon trade was worth approximately $10 billion annually, nearly the same size as the European cocaine market. The Assad regime directly pocketed an estimated quarter of this, making Captagon Syria's most valuable export by far. Some other sources report the figures might be even higher, with Der Spiegel estimating that income from the drug in 2021 alone reached $5.7 billion. The regime didn't just profit from the trade, it also used it as a powerful diplomatic tool. By controlling the flow of Captagon into neighboring countries, Assad could apply pressure or offer concessions to achieve his political goals. This strategy played a significant role in Syria's readmission to the Arab League in 2023, though the promised crackdown on drug trafficking never materialized. Recent discoveries following Assad's fall have exposed the accurate industrial scale of Syria's Captagon operation. The most significant findings have come from 3 primary locations: the Maza Air Base in Damascus, a car trading company in Assad's hometown of Latakia, and perhaps most notably, a former potato chip factory in Douma near the capital. The Douma facility, which operated under the seemingly innocuous name Captain Corn, provides a perfect example of how the regime industrialized drug production. According to rebel fighters who discovered the site, the factory was seized from its legitimate owner in 2018 and personally authorized by Maher al-Assad for conversion to Captagon production. Investigators found industrial-scale manufacturing equipment, vast quantities of precursor chemicals, and sophisticated packaging operations. The setup was remarkably professional. The facility operated 24/7, with workers sleeping on bunks besides the production lines. The basement level contained rows of pill presses capable of producing thousands of tablets per hour. Chemical storage areas held tons of caustic soda, a key ingredient in methamphetamine production, alongside other precursor chemicals. The regime's attention to quality control was also notable. Each production facility maintained testing laboratories to ensure consistent dosage and purity. This wasn't just about maximizing profits. It was about building brand reliability in the illegal drug market. The famous twin crescent logo stamped on each pill became a mark of quality that commanded premium prices. The scale of chemical procurement was equally impressive. In 2020 alone, Syria imported 50 tons of pseudoephedrine, far more than could be justified for legitimate pharmaceutical use. Other precursor chemicals were obtained through front companies or diverted from legitimate industrial users. The regime's control of customs and ports made such imports relatively simple. The facilities weren't just limited to pill production. They also manufactured sophisticated concealment devices for smuggling. At that very same Duma factory, investigators recently on site in Syria found workshops producing hollow voltage regulators, fake fruit, and modified industrial equipment, all designed to hide pills for export. The level of engineering expertise involved suggested the regime had recruited skilled technical personnel specifically for this purpose. The attention to detail in concealment methods was remarkable. At the recently discovered facilities, investigators found Captagon pills hidden in an astounding variety of containers and products. Custom-made hollow fruit, so realistic they could fool initial inspections into thinking they were regular fruit rather than pills. Industrial paper rolls containing hidden compartments capable of concealing millions of tablets. In fact, one such shipment intercepted in Europe contained $1.5 billion worth of Captagon pills. Even mundane items like LED lights and regulators were specifically manufactured with secret compartments. In July of 2020, Italian authorities at the port of Salerno seized another 84 billion pills worth another $1 billion, hidden inside gears and paper rolls shipped from Syria's port of Latakia. These seizures demonstrated the industrial production scale and the regime's ability to move enormous quantities through official channels. But these smuggling routes themselves were carefully planned and diverse. In addition to the exports intended for Europe, the primary land routes went through Jordan and Iraq to reach wealthy Gulf markets, particularly Saudi Arabia. The regime developed these routes to disguise the origin of shipments, and some consignments would be routed through multiple European ports before reaching their intended destinations in the Gulf. They divided Syria into sectors, each overseen by military officers who coordinated with the smugglers and provided protection. These officers worked closely with Hezbollah, which controlled key routes along the Lebanon-Syria border and provided expertise gained from decades of drug trafficking experience. The network adapted to increasingly sophisticated techniques when traditional smuggling methods became too risky. Recent evidence from these seizures shows they began using drones to ferry drugs across borders, particularly into Jordan. They even trained carrier pigeons to transport smaller quantities of pills, making detection almost nearly impossible. And in some cases, the Syrian army modified surface-to-air missiles to fire drug packages across borders, equipped with tracking devices for recovery. The smuggling operation's financial structure was also equally sophisticated. Profits were typically split 70-30 between the 4th Division and various facilitators. The money moved through a complex web of front companies and legitimate businesses, making it virtually impossible to track. The regime also used the drug trade to circumvent international sanctions, converting Captagon profits into hard currency that could be used to purchase vital supplies. The involvement of Assad family members and regime insiders in the Captagon trade was extensive and well documented. At the top of the pyramid, as we said before, sat Maher Assad. But the network extended far beyond just military control. Samir Kamal Assad, the president's paternal cousin, operated multiple Captagon factories in al-Bassa, south of Latakia. That same Der Spiegel investigation linked him to a massive 14-ton shipment seized in Italy. He managed various corporate entities that provided cover for drug operations while maintaining close ties with Syrian leadership. Wasim Badia al-Assad, another cousin, was also deeply involved in both manufacturing and trafficking. He worked closely with Hassan Mohammed Daku, known as the king or emperor of Captagon. In Daku's trial in Beirut in 2021, damning WhatsApp messages between him and a figure only identified as the boss, believed to be Ghassan Bilal, Maher al-Assad's deputy in the 4th Division. But the business side of the operation involved numerous prominent public figures. Khalil Kaddour, described in U.S. Treasury documents as a key drug producer and facilitator. Amer Khiti, a Syrian politician who oversaw multiple businesses involved in production. And smuggling, Tara al-Kayali, whose shipping company, Neptunus LLC, was instrumental in moving drugs through the port of Latakia. The level of state involvement was so comprehensive that even routine government functions were co-opted into the trade. Custom officials were paid to look the other way. Agricultural permits were used for front companies, and diplomatic pouches were used to move drugs across borders. The flood of Captagon from Syria has had devastating consequences across the Middle East for years, with effects that will reverberate for a generation to come. Saudi Arabia, as the largest market for the drug, has borne the heaviest burden. Between 2012 and 2021, Saudi authorities intercepted 67% of all global Captagon seizures. These official seizures represent only the tip of the iceberg. Experts estimate that law enforcement typically catches only about 20% of trafficked drugs. The human cost in Saudi Arabia has been particularly severe. According to the Secretary General of Saudi Arabia's National Committee for Narcotics Control, the majority of the kingdom's drug addicts are between 12 and 20 years old. The drug's appeal spans social classes. Students use it in study. Laborers take it to endure long work shifts. And wealthy youth consume it as a party drug. In May 2023, Saudi Interior Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Saud was forced to pledge an aggressive crackdown on traffickers, smugglers, and anyone threatening the kingdom's youth. Jordan, sharing a long border with Syria, found itself on the front lines of the crisis. The country's military engagement with smugglers evolved into what amounts into a low-intensity border war. In January 2022, during one particularly violent clash, Jordanian forces killed 27 smugglers attempting to cross the border. The traffickers became increasingly militant, often backed by armed escorts with sophisticated weapons provided by the Syrian government. By 2024, before the fall of Assad, Jordan had transformed its northern border into a militarized zone. The cat and mouse game grew increasingly sophisticated and deadly. Lebanon also paid a heavy price. The dilemma that played a significant role in Syria's readmission to the Arab League in 2023, through the promised cooperation in fighting drug trafficking, proved hollow. Perhaps most troubling was how the drug trade began to corrupt institutions across the region. In October 2024, Saudi authorities arrested 16 government employees, including ministry officials, for their involvement in facilitating Captagon smuggling. The immense profits available through the trade boosted corruption networks that extended far beyond Syria's borders. But with Assad's fall in December 2024, Syria's new authorities under Ahmed al-Shara have made dismantling the Captagon trade a priority, at least in their words. In his victory speech at Damascus Umayyad Mosque, al-Shara declared, "Syria has become the largest Captagon factory in the world. Today, Syria is being cleansed, thanks to the grace of Allah." The new government has begun destroying stockpiles and raiding production facilities. However, experts warn this is not enough, whereas production may move from Syria to other Middle East or European countries. The expertise and networks developed during Syria's Captagon years won't simply disappear. The technical knowledge and production, the smuggling routes, and the criminal connections remain intact. Iraq appears particularly vulnerable to becoming the next central hub of Captagon production. Iraqi authorities seized 30 more times Captagon in 2023 than in 2019, with more than 4.1 tons of tablets confiscated in 2023 alone. The country's position at the crossroads of regional smuggling routes makes it an attractive alternate to Syria. The demand of the equation presents another crucial challenge. The international community's response will be critical, and some things happening in the United States can also take effect. U.S. Representative French Hill, who sponsored the Captagon Act in the U.S. Congress, sees Assad's fall as validation of the sanctions strategy. However, there's concern that beyond Iraq, countries including Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, Libya, and even some European nations could become new production hubs. The sophisticated concealment methods and trafficking routes developed by the Assad regime provides a blueprint that other criminal networks might follow. Now, just to conclude, before we get to questions, the fall of the regime marks the end of one chapter in the story of Captagon, but the network's expertise and demand that fueled Syria's drug empire remain. This marks a genuine opportunity to address the Captagon crisis, but also it might force the trade to adapt and relocate to areas that remain to be unseen. Thank you, Achnaf, and now I stand ready for questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Craig, for your insights on a very interesting, albeit seldom covered topic. Now, I'll begin here with a question from Carrie Hillebrand, who asks, how has the war impacted Hezbollah's narcotics business in Latin America, and in particular in the Northern Triangle?
So the war itself actually is going to have, in my opinion, Hezbollah investing more resources in South America now that many of their smuggling routes from Iran through Iraq into Syria and then into Lebanon to be cut off. So if anything, Hezbollah is going to rely more on cocaine production rather than on Captagon production, or at least Captagon smuggling. Beyond that, as I said in my initial remarks, now that Syria has been cut off as a source of Captagon production, you may very well see South America becoming a new hub for Captagon production, in addition to cocaine and other drugs which are already being made there, especially in the Triangle area.
All right, thank you. Now, to follow up, there's been, of course, major concerns with illegal narcotics crossing through the U.S. southern border, but we typically immediately just think of fentanyl and amphetamines when we think of this. Is there any evidence of Syrian Captagon finding its way into the United States? And if so, how has that affected the well-being of Americans?
Captagon is not a particularly popular drug in the United States, at least not yet. Domestic methamphetamine production still holds the market in terms of those who are going for speed and for other drugs. But again, you may see the know-how, the expertise, and other things involved with the trade come to U.S. shores. It's not like Europe. It's not like the Middle East, at least not yet.
Now, the Assad regime had avenues through Hezbollah into Latin America. I mean, it's a little unsure what Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham has in terms of their delivery avenues. Do they have a foothold in this hemisphere that could make that a possibility?
I mean, does HTS have a foothold in the United States?
Or at least, in the Western Hemisphere to bring it into the United States?
HTS, at least publicly, has declared that it is not going to be involved in Captagon production, even though some ISIS affiliates and some other groups, which are now part of the HTS collection or alliance, previously relied on Captagon production to fund their armed efforts against Assad about 10 years ago. But as I said during my remarks, after Russia and Iran intervened in the Syrian civil war, Assad was able to monopolize all the laboratories, systematically put together the production cycle for Captagon. And I think HTS is now seeking to destroy that rather than to facilitate the production just under a new regime to go to Europe. So I don't think HTS will be involved in Captagon production. However, Iraqi militias, Hezbollah, Jordanian criminal gangs, other groups may find a way to replicate the blueprint that Assad put together and then to use Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, other routes, whether they be land and circuitous through the Caucasus and into Europe through Bulgaria and Greece, or the sea routes that were moving from Latakia. Now they may move from Beirut and find their way across the Mediterranean into Europe. You even had Captagon shipments that were intercepted in areas as far away as Malaysia and in Lagos, Nigeria. So we'll see what happens with these networks. But the core of Captagon production as controlled by the Syrian government under the Assad regime is now over.
All right, thank you. Now, moving on to a question here from Jonathan Shaw, who asks, have prices of Captagon been observed to have significantly increased in Saudi Arabia as supply has dwindled? And why is Captagon preferred to other amphetamines?
So again, as that Egyptian doctor had said in his trial in Germany about 3 decades ago, perhaps Captagon is the drug of choice because it's not alcohol or otherwise banned by the Quran. But I think the real reason is because it was cheap to manufacture, it was readily available on the Syrian and other Middle Eastern countries' streets. And there has been an actual effort to clamp down on heroin production coming out of Afghanistan. At least there was until the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Iran has a pretty significant heroin interception program, even though about 2 to 3 million Iranian citizens are addicted to dope. And I think that also, if you look at other drugs, whether it be hashish, marijuana, cocaine, it's a lot harder to procure the latter hard drugs in the Middle East than it is for what was available up until December 8th. In terms of the price of Captagon right now, you just saw a 4-ton shipment being intercepted by the Saudi authorities on January 3rd. So even though most were the ability to produce it, where 90% of its production facilities were shut down in December by HTS, you still have massive quantities being shipped to Middle Eastern countries. So now the next step is to gather all the U.S. forces, all the Middle Eastern forces, and counter narcotic agencies that were working in international coalition to find out where is it now being produced and to find ways to mitigate that production and smuggling to Middle Eastern states.
All right, thank you. Now, you sort of touched on this in your remarks earlier, that Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham basically, in their, on the surface, in their own words, are trying to get rid of this industry and destroy the Captagon production and disbursement. Do you suppose it's possible that this new government in Syria is only taking these actions to, so to speak, clean their own hands while encouraging the proliferation of this in other countries, like, as you said, Iraq?
Well, to be fair, HTS had a pretty significant anti-narcotics effort in Idlib province, which it ruled for the decade prior to it taking over Damascus. So if one is to look at the example of how it instituted domestic law and criminal enforcement in its area that it had previously administered, that might be an example of how it might look at this nationally throughout Syria. But just looking at their Islamist characteristic, the way in which they sort of look at narcotics the same way that Saudi Arabia or other Sunni Orthodox groups, and I wouldn't even call them Sunni Orthodox. I mean, these guys were affiliated with Al Qaeda and ISIS up until a few years ago. But I think that in their belief system, Captagon is as nefarious as other haram types of things, whether it be alcohol or drugs or anything else might be considered disallowed by the Quran. I don't think HTS is particularly observing what's happening with Captagon production outside of Syria. It's just trying to take it out root and stem in the country because it sees it as an evil twofold. One, it was financing the government that was its primary target in its rebellion against Assad. And two, it was corrupting Syrian youth and providing a vehicle for which Syria was corrupting the rest of the region. And in fact, if it can eliminate Captagon, it'll be to the betterment of HTS as it relates to its relations with Gulf Arab states and the rest of the Arab League. So I think they have a net positive by doing it. It's not just trying to shift the burden to someone else.
All right, thank you. Now, we are reaching the end here, but I would like to ask a question of my own here because I am curious about these carrier pigeons that you mentioned. That is remarkable. Do you happen to know how these carrier pigeons were even discovered?
Someone ended up dying in the desert with little pills attached to their legs. So if you were intercepted, but yeah, every method, tunnels, rockets. I mean, these guys really had all the works to be able to get as many pills out there as possible. and you saw the resultant influx of income going to the Assad regime.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Greg. We have unfortunately reached the end of our podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us to discuss such an interesting topic.
Thank you very much, enough.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, if you have not already done so, please be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Forum's YouTube channel, where you can watch this series as well as over 400 of our past podcast episodes. And as always, we thank you all again for joining us and for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.